Good. Lovely. So welcome to the third seminar in this series of seminars on the nature of mind, in the Nature of Mind project. So it's really lovely to have our local Oceania seminars. I always enjoy it. It's very important, and I feel like it's a great opportunity for us to get together and think deeply, and also to see each other and catch up in this format. This month we're looking at the work of Bernardo Kastrup, and I'm sure Nagashuri and Dharmananda will say a little bit more about that in a second. But just a little bit about Nagashuri and Dharmananda. So Nagashuri is was FWBO, what was Triratna before, in the late 1980s, and then she was attending the Sydney Buddhist Centre, which apparently was above a gun shop on George Street, which I didn't know until recently. And in the late 90s, Nagashuri went to England, did a Karuna Trust Dornock, which some of you might be familiar with, quite an intense practice, and then worked in the Cambridge Evolution Shop. She was ordained in the year 2000, and has worked for extended periods in India, and is now based in the Sydney Buddhist Centre, around the Sydney Buddhist Centre, and she's very active and has a wonderful, thriving Dharma life. And if you do end up in Sydney or visiting the Sydney Buddhist Centre, it's likely that you might bump into her, because she's very involved with lots of different things. So it's lovely to have you, Nagashuri, lovely to have you here. And Dharmananda is from the UK originally. He was ordained in 1978, so he's been ordained for a long time. He's been very involved with right livelihood projects in the early years of his involvement. Then he moved to Vajraloka, which some of you probably a lot of you are familiar with. It's a meditation community in the UK. He did that in 1984 and came to Australia in 1989. And then migrated in 1990. So he's been around in Australia for a long time too. He's also been involved with the Sydney Buddhist Centre until, I note say 1917, which I don't think that is correct. I should have read that carefully. I'm going to assume 1997. And now lives in the Central Coast, enjoying a retired life. Dharmananda isn't feeling 100%, but even so, he's really kindly joined us today and putting quite a lot of work into this as well. So lovely to have you here, Dharmananda, too. Lovely. So welcome, both of you. I might just hand it over to you. I'm going to pin you both. So if you need my help, please just do call out. And for everybody else, if you can keep yourselves muted for the time being, that would be lovely. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Great. I've never been pinned before, but I can tell everybody it doesn't hurt. Thanks very much indeed, Varadi. Lovely to be introduced. Oh, and lovely to see Virija with Jinavadra. Great. Good. So we're just going to say a little bit before we start into the interview itself, in terms of our own responses to it. And I have to say, I didn't meet philosophy until I got to university as an undergraduate. And I just loved philosophical debate. I loved the to and fro, and, strong minds really trying to nut something out, not arguing, but really sort of saying, I think it's this way, no, etc. And so I really enjoyed the conversation between Deva and Bernardo Kastrup, and they were sparking one another off, and in a way they sparked me off as well as we went along. I did find myself wondering about some of the arguments, but I didn't join in. But I'll ask Dharmananda how he felt about
it. Sorry if I'm not very responsive. I really am not 100% at all. Yeah, so look, I could resonate to some degree with Bernardo Kastrup, in that I, once upon a time, was a scientist, and my pursuit of the nature of mind and existence and those sorts of questions was not being answered by science. I started looking, not so much that I got disillusioned with science, but I started looking way outside of science in order to answer those questions, and was very happy when I blundered through the doors of Brighton Buddhist Centre and immediately found almost literally the answer to all my questions. Anyway, sort of share something of a background there. One big difference is that I've never ventured into the realms of philosophy. The P word wasn't used in the education that I had as a young fellow, and I've not really found it a very interesting area of human mental activity since. So there's where I'm coming from. Nagashiri would like to give us a bit more of Bernardo Kastrup's background and qualifications.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Quite extraordinary, I feel. So obviously highly intelligent, is Dutch, and he has not one but 2 PhDs. So his first PhD was in computer engineering, particularly looking at artificial intelligence, and clearly got a long way with that and started to recognize however you tinkered with things in the silicon world, you weren't ever going to get to experience. And at that stage, he just sort of dropped, I don't think he dropped it completely, but he put it to one side. And he also has a PhD in philosophy. So quite an extraordinary range of intellectual pursuits. And as far as his work experience goes, he did work originally for the European Organization for Nuclear Research, and more recently for the Phillips Research Laboratory, but now is a full-time philosopher and very, very enthusiastic and wanting to convert the world to analytical idealism. I'm being a bit naughty there, but he's convinced that here is the answer. So I really want to hand it back to Dhammananda now to just talk about that, the root idea of analytical idealism.
Yeah, okay, so yes, the first clip we're going to have is an intro to Kastrup's roots in the philosophical school of idealism. Just take a broader look at the moment. In this Nature of Mind series, we are looking at various perspectives on the nature of mind, and by extension of that, the nature of what mind experiences as a world out there. So Kastrup presents us with a theory of mind based in the philosophical school of, I suppose is the word, of idealism. So just a couple of words before we have the clip on materialism versus idealism. So, well, I suppose like me, Kastrup left behind the default position of materialism, which as a scientist one is basically following. So material holds that matter is the fundamental substance of the universe or of nature, and that all things, including our mental states and our consciousness, are as a result of material interactions. And from that point of view, I always feel dreadfully sorry for those branches of science that are trying to sort of understand consciousness on the basis of brain research. Brain research can tell us some very clever things about how consciousness of an individual works, but you know, from my Buddhist perspective, they're miles away from the mystery of mind itself. I won't take too much of a sidetrack into that. I could be here all day. On the other hand, idealism is a more metaphysical view that associates reality to ideas and perceptions in the mind rather than to material objects. So in idealism, what a person understands to be reality reflects the workings of their own mind. So in idealism, reality doesn't really exist independent of the mind, but is rather dependent on the mind. And from the names that are up on the panels, I can see that most, if not all of you, are sort of seasoned Buddhists. So we're very familiar with the Buddhist perspective on that, that reality is a perception. The external reality is a perception of the mind. So let's listen to the clip of Bernardo Kastrup introducing his position as an idealist.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with the big question, which is, what is idealism? What is this big idea, analytical idealism?
It's the notion that reality is essentially mental, that it's made of mental processes. Now, not your mental processes alone or my mental processes alone. Idealism recognizes that there is an objective world outside our individual minds, but it infers that that objective world is itself made of transpersonal mental processes, which present themselves to our observation in the form we call perception. And of course, perception is eminently qualitative. It is mental. It entails colors, flavors, smells, and these are mental properties. And the notion of analytic idealism is that these qualities on the screen of perception are inner representations of mental processes that are out there, natural mental processes out there, which we have no access to from a first-person perspective, but which we get a representation of in the form of the physical world we see.
Okay, so the idea is that although we tend to think, and we're brought up in our culture to think that somehow there's a world out there that's sort of propping up our perceptions, that's kind of behind our ordinary perceptions, actually that's a kind of mistake. All there is perception, although maybe you could help clarify what's the difference between it's all in my head and idealism as you propose it.
So idealism does acknowledge that there is a world out there. What it denies is that such a world out there is essentially different from mentation, that it is made of matter in the sense strictly defined under metaphysical materialism, which is something that is fully described in terms of quantities alone and has no inherent qualities. In other words, under materialism, the world out there is such that there is nothing it is like to be the world out there. Under idealism, there is still a world out there, but there is also something it is like to be the world out there. And we perceive these mental processes out there in the form that we call the physical world. But there is still an objective world out there. It's just mental and not physical in the way that it is defined under physicalism or materialism.
Dear. And I find sorry, I've got the wrong clips. Speaker. I find that really confusing. So please, Dhammananda, this idea that there's a world out there. So yeah, they accept there's a world out there, but it's all mentation, transpersonal mentation. It's not my experience at all, but I do, of course, accept that we create our own perception of the world out there. You know, it's my mental states, my memory, my moods and things that will filter and, you know, colour the world out there. But over to you.
Okay. Yes, we could talk for a long time on this, just this clip. I think what Bernardo Kastrup has come to in his reflections on from the idealist point of view is really a similar understanding that we have, that we as beings who are conscious through our senses and know a world out there, have a perception of the world out there that is coloured very, very strongly by our senses. Our consciousness itself is made up of the experience of senses most of the time. And what Kastrup, the point that Kastrup seems to want to make is that the world out there doesn't have as inherent qualities the things that we perceive it to have. So, for instance, the redness of the setting sun isn't due to redness in the setting sun itself, it's due to redness in our perception. And as I started saying, we as beings who are aware of the world outside through sense perceptions, we're subject to knowing a universe out there that the sense perceptions are able to pick up. So we've got pigment, literally, we've got pigments in our eyes that pick up a red color. So when we see a particular phase of the sun as it's setting, it says red, but it doesn't mean that the setting sun is actually red. So the quality of redness isn't in the setting sun, it's in our eyes, in the pigment, and that becomes something in our perception, therefore it becomes something that we are conscious of. I do remember very vividly when I was doing A-level physics, our teachers telling us at the appropriate point in the course that all light is black. Now, to you or I, no, there's white light and there's red light and there's yellow light. But no, from a physics point of view, which in a way is what Bernardo Kastrup is getting at, all light is black. In other words, the redness and greenness and whatever we understand it through, it's got nothing to do with the light itself. The light is just a vibration. And from that point of view, it doesn't have the red, yellow, green, etc. qualities that we know it through our eyesight. If you're colorblind, you don't know that the red setting sun is the red setting sun. You don't have the same perception of an apparent universe out there. So you don't project or impute the same qualities on it. So in a much broader canvas than just that example of colors of light, we are perceiving the universe outside of us to have a whole lot of qualities that it doesn't necessarily have. I don't really like Kastrup's blank canvas that he gives it. He more or less says that the universe out there is inert and we project everything onto it. I don't think he's got the right idea there. That's my impression on that.
Yes, and I couldn't have articulated it that way, but it's also my impression of it. But it does, his stripping back of materialism, I do find very attractive. And, you know, the fact, and we'll go on to this, but the fact that, you know, you can tell me that all light is black, or that's the physicist's position on it. But of course, if all light was black, we wouldn't see anything on this screen, would we? So that, yeah, I'm left sort of grasping for straws within it. But I do appreciate the emphasis that Kastrup puts on mind. I mean, he sees mind as I mean, I think he'd say primary, and it's primary in terms of our personal experience, that you know, all we can see, all we understand of the world comes through our perceptions, our senses and things like that. But that doesn't mean that that's all that, you know, that there's that's all that's out there as well, that is a mentation out there. But have I got totally confused there?
Probably not. Because the point is that these ideas are, there's something that we have to work with and ask ourselves the question, is this right? is it right that the universe out there is merely a projection of mentation going on with me? Is it right that the universe out there is completely neutral, doesn't have qualities, or is there another position? So, you know, the ideas that we're being presented with there in terms of the idealist position is not so much a statement of how it is, even, you know, I mean, and even though many of those statements seem to agree with the perspective of people from deep meditation, they are really questions. That's, to my mind, they're you know, they're not really valuable unless they are questions for us in terms of asking ourselves what really is my experience of this phenomenon. Yes, we don't experience light as black because we don't have a sort of a receptor that only can see it as black. You know, we have color receptors, and they tell us a different story. If we had eyesight that could only read the phenomenon of light as just one vibration, as it were, then it'd be a different universe.
It would be. And it immediately makes me think of the universe of non-human beings, you know, the universe of dogs or something like that. But I think we should go on to the second clip. Is that okay with you, Dhammananda?
Yeah, that's very much where I'm moving. This gives us, brings out Kastrup's emphasis on perception as the interface between awareness of the world and the reality of what the world is. Well, can we say that what the world is like? Because how do we know? How can we say firmly what the world is like? So let's hear some more from Kastrup.
Okay, so it's like, usually we think that there's life and there are beings who are conscious, and then there's us maybe who are the most conscious beings. And all the life, all the kind of subjectivity, the emotions, the love, the hate, and so on, it just happens in here, happens within our nervous systems. And everything else is just dead matter. That's kind of, and you're challenging that and saying that's not the case. Everything is made of the same kind of stuff. It's all made of subjectivity, but we have a particular viewpoint on that. Is that kind of what it's?
That's precisely correct. So essentially, it is materialism as a metaphysics that says that the world you experience around you, this world made of colors and flavors and sounds, materialism says this world is actually inside your head alone, because it's your brain that is supposed to somehow generate the colors and the melodies and the flavors and the smells, because these are qualities. And under materialism, qualities are epiphenomenal. They are secondary. They are byproducts of brain activity. So under materialism, the world of qualities that you experience around you is supposed to be inside your skull. And the world that is really out there is purely abstract. And you cannot visualize it because it's supposed to be devoid of qualities. Now, under idealism, the world that is really out there is also qualitative. It is also made of mental processes, but not individuated mental processes, not personal mental processes, just mental processes at large, out there, natural mental processes that unfold in the broader field of nature as a whole, in which our perception has evolved to collect information about in the form that we call perception. But the perceived world is just a representation, an appearance of what is in and of itself transpersonal mental processes.
Phew. Well, do you feel ready to carry on, Dhammananda?
Yes, I'll say yes.
Thank you.
So I think from that we're invited to examine the idea that there is life, a living experience, and out there, and versus an inert universe. I want to examine the idea that, I think we're invited to examine the idea that objects, things in the universe, don't have inherent qualities, which I said earlier, and that we create the perception of them, colors, temperature, weight. I mean, he gives some curious, I don't know in that clip, but he does give some interesting examples later on that, you know, the difference between 5 and 50 kilograms is a perception rather than something that we call feeling, rather than the difference between 5 and 50 kilograms. I'll leave you to have your own thoughts on that. We need to examine the idea that the world is made of mental processes, as in under idealism, rather than that our perception faculty has created the world. And obviously I'm seeding questions for the chat groups as we talk, rather than giving a necessary explanation. So my question point for this section, and I'm aware of the time and to cover the last bit, is, do we really live in a subjective universe of our own perception, or does it have qualities that are independent of our perception? So that those questions will come up in the chat box or something later. So I think I'd like to move to the next section, which is something that Kastrup talks about, is his notion of convenient fictions. In his writings, Kastrup talks about a common reality as being dreamed up, our common world we know as being something that we dream up. He speaks of the entities that we find in the objectified world as being convenient fictions, because if you start from the point that says, look, this universe in a way is a dreamed up reality, then you start thinking, hang on, but I do bump into things. I didn't dream bumping into that wall. I didn't dream, lots of events that happen in life. So he's come to a term which he calls convenient fictions to cover this sort of knotty problem. So he acknowledges that there's an objective world in which we, as aware beings, find ourselves living, but can we use those things which are part of our nature? But we use those things that are part of our seeming nature to navigate our place in the world. So he gives an example of gravity. Gravity was doubted when Newton first proposed it. In fact, he was considered to be an idiot because he was talking about this invisible force. This in a world where people believed in a particular invisible force that supposedly created this world and human beings along with it. I think you know what I'm referring to. It took a long time for gravity to be accepted, but then gravity then becomes something that we can use to understand how we navigate the world around us. It becomes what Kastrup calls a convenient fiction. That convenient fiction grew more sophisticated with Einstein. As time goes on, as we do become more aware, I suppose in some ways, in a scientific way, we become more aware of what the universe around us is like. What he calls our convenient fictions become more sophisticated. But that leaves us with the idea that, well, are they all convenient fictions? Hang on, at some point, are they not what the universe is really like? Let's move to the clip and see what Kastrup has to say.
Back to my days, I mentioned to you in my email, I used to be part of academic philosophy of science. I was really in that world, and there were these debates in academic philosophy of science between realism and anti-realism about physical stuff. And hopefully we'll bring this towards Buddhism at some point. I'll see if I can do that. But anyway, let's stay in philosophy of science for now. And, when I was studying, there were these debates, and there were anti-realists who claimed that all science is doing all science is doing is just we're recording patterns that we see in the world. We're noticing patterns, and then we're making predictions on the basis of these patterns. It's, as you say, it's a map. We're making maps of reality, but we don't know what the reality is. There's just this incredible influx of phenomena that we're perceiving, and then we notice regularities. And how did you know? What instinct drove you to say that there was no more than that? We had no reason to think there's more than just maps here, because so many people don't. So many scientists don't have that instinct. What do you think was different about you?
I paid attention to the history of science. Maybe that's that's the difference. Look, theoretical entities in physics are convenient fictions, in the sense that they give us a way to think about the world. But what we think, the way we think, is not necessarily the world. It's just an operationally useful way to think about the world. And these convenient fictions, they change over time. They have always changed. When Newton proposed that there was this magical, invisible force acting instantaneously at a distance to pull the apple down to the ground or to keep the moon in its orbit, which was gravity, this instantaneous, invisible force that acts at a distance. It took the French 50 years to stop laughing of Newton's convenient fiction, because it was just magical woo-woo back in the 17th century. Things that didn't couldn't causally interact with one another. But that convenient fiction, this invisible, instantaneous force of gravity, allowed us to put a man on the moon and land a spaceship on a comet or an asteroid. But then Einstein came along and he said, no, Newton's convenient fiction is no longer convenient because it doesn't help us predict the orbit of Mercury with accuracy, and it doesn't help us understand why we can see stars that are actually behind the sun. So he came up with another convenient fiction, which is that the very fabric of space-time twists and bends and is malleable and can be bent by mass. That's also a convenient fiction. And why is it a fiction? Because nature behaves as though the fabric of space-time could be twisted and bent. So convenient fictions are stories that capture nature's behavior. In other words, nature behaves as though those theoretical entities were true. And that's all we need to predict nature's behavior and do science and technology successfully.
Phew. I'm still very much stuck in gravity. For me, the fabric of space-time is totally unimaginable, and I didn't know we could see stars behind the sun. Of course, you'd need an incredible telescope or whatever. And so, you know, I find this very interesting, but it seems to me that they're much more like provisional truths. That there's a certain, you know, factual accuracy about the apple falling or me dropping a cup on the floor and it breaks and things like that. So I find this word convenient fictions not particularly helpful.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you then, I'm sure. I also like provisional truths or provisional understandings is, well, just another way of putting the same thing. I think we've got to allow Kastrup to have his own way of putting things. But I think his idea of convenient fictions does cover the idea that we understand the world in terms of our current level of knowledge and insightfulness. Not to mention insight, as with big eyes that we talk about in the Dharma. Insightfulness will do for this purpose. And that we can navigate our understanding of the universe in which we find ourselves, this island of you know, isolated consciousness that we start off with quite successfully. So, as I say, yeah, we've agreed that convenient fictions could be provisional truths to convey that. but nonetheless, we do have to navigate the reality of living with other beings who form part of our perception of the seeming world or not. And Kastrup does, in a way, suggest that we are living in a commonly created, convenient fiction, as it were. That's an interesting question. Why do a group of people sitting around in a room, if you place an orange on a table in the middle of the room and they all agree that it's an orange, why do they all agree that it's an orange? Banti asked that question once in a seminar I was in, and I foolishly said, well, maybe they got a common karma. But let's leave the game. This is an interesting kind of question. Why do we have a common, seemingly common perception of reality? Or is it just that we've got a language for persuading one another that there's a common perception of the reality of the world around us? So we might care to reflect on our worldview and ask, what are the convenient fictions in my worldview? I think this is a very useful, to me, it's a very useful question that comes out of what Viryadeva, talked with Kastrup about. What are our convenient fictions? Which to me is an expression of something quite fundamental that we all need to recognize, is what is belief? What do we believe in? The well-known sort of dismissive academic Richard Dawkins put on a TV documentary, if not a series, a documentary about faith, condemning faith and how useless faith was. In other words, Christian faith. And from his very, very kind of highly intellectualized scientific point of view, sort of casting aspersions on that. No. You've got the wrong idea. It's not about faith, it's about belief. Dawkins cannot see that he has an enormous amount of faith in scientific materialism, but dismisses religious faith as being poo-poo, woo-woo, back as in the as in the way that Newton's ideas were treated as woo-woo. So the word belief comes from, the roots are roughly from Mercian language, gelifa, which means to hold dear. So our original word for belief was that which you hold dear. By about the 14th century, it came to mean that you have faith in God. And then by about the 17th century, it came to mean that which you accept as true without any proof that it's true. And I think this whole concept of convenient fictions, to me, the value of that is that it gets us to look at, okay, what do we believe in and why do we believe in it? So wish I've lost my place on the
No, well, I'd love to respond to that. I'd love to respond to that, Dharmananda. I've had the good fortune to have had conversations, of course, with Dharmananda about this. And so I've had a chance to think about it. And I have a deep belief in the value and the benefit of ethics and the 10 precepts that in the Triratna Buddhist organization we take on at different points on the path. And, I can look around the world and see all sorts of people that are highly unethical, exploitative, unkind, and they don't seem to be suffering too much. But I just know in my own world and in the world that I live in and that the people I interact with, that being ethical it leads to greater harmony, greater peace, greater feeling of well-being in myself, and I hope that has that effect on others. So, I know I have a deep belief in skillful actions will have skillful consequences, and unskillful will have unskillful consequences. When is quite another matter. I could go on to say that I have enormous faith in the power of metta. And we often send metta, a sense of loving kindness, well-wishing out to the world, and believe it has an effect. I mean, certainly you could call this woo-woo if you wanted to. And I don't know that I was ever entirely convinced of that until I had a rather bad fall and was completely dependent on others for a period of time. And a great deal of the metta that came towards me was physical. It was people coming and making me food and making sure I had, the medication I needed, etc., etc. But there was also just so much metta in the air, and it came through, of course, in texts and things like that. But I made the most amazing recovery. My GP was quite surprised. And I do believe that, yes, it was the power of medication and some of those other things, but as well, just that metta in so many different forms. And finally, I will just say, I know another one of my beliefs is that the world would be a better place if we had gender equality. But over to you, Dharmananda. How about you? Where do you stand on your convenient fictions or your provisional truths?
I'm going to duck for cover because I'm very mindful that we're using our time. So what I want to do is just to remind us of what the question points are that came out of the clips we've chosen. So the first one is that the question to take to the breakout groups is that idealism and materialism each represent a polarized view of reality. How do we reconcile them with experience? The second question in relation to perception is, how do we live in a subjective universe of our perception? How do we really live in a subjective universe of our perception? Or does it have qualities independent of our perception? And the final question regarding convenient fictions. Convenient fictions would seem to be a recognition that we choose to believe some things to be true. What convenient fictions do we recognize that we follow? I think you will be getting them in the chat box, so you don't have to have remembered them or written them down. I should have said that at the beginning. So pass now to Vara Devi, and she will control us into the next part of the program.
I will. Thanks, Dharmananda.